September 15th, 1945. The sterile corridors of Tokyo General Hospital echo with the soft footsteps of nurses in starched white uniforms, their faces marked by exhaustion and uncertainty. Outside, American jeeps rumble through streets still scarred by bombing campaigns. Inside this medical sanctuary, Japanese nurses Ayako Tanaka and her colleagues move with practiced efficiency, tending to wounded soldiers and civilians alike, their world forever changed by Japan's surrender just weeks before. The acrid smell of antiseptic mingles with something unexpected, the sweet aroma of American tobacco drifting through the ward windows. These women, trained in the rigid traditions of Japanese medical service, had spent years believing that capture by Allied forces meant death or dishonor. The propaganda that had shaped their understanding painted American soldiers as merciless demons, barbarous invaders who showed no quarter to the defeated. They had been taught that the enemy possessed neither honor nor humanity, that their very presence would bring suffering and degradation to the land of the rising sun. But September 15th would shatter every preconception they held about their former enemies. The morning began like countless others since the surrender. Nurse Tanaka, a 23-year-old graduate of the Imperial Nurses Academy, made her rounds through the overcrowded ward. Malnutrition cases filled every available bed. Children with hollow eyes stared at ceiling tiles, their small bodies bearing the weight of a nation's defeat. The hospital, like all of Japan, existed in a state of desperate scarcity. Rice rations had dwindled to handful-sized portions. Medicine was a luxury reserved for the most critical cases. Even bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart in nurses' hands. Into this world of want stepped Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 11th Airborne Division, leading a medical survey team tasked with assessing civilian hospital conditions. At 25, the Irish-American medic from Boston had already witnessed the full spectrum of war's cruelty across the Pacific theater. Guadalcanal, Leyte, Luzon. Each campaign had hardened him to suffering, yet something about the Japanese hospital moved him unexpectedly. Perhaps it was the sight of nurses working 18-hour shifts without complaint, or the way they maintained their dignity despite having nothing. The historical record, preserved in occupation force reports, and Sergeant O'Brien reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small green package. A 9-cigarette pack of Lucky Strike, standard issue in C rations since 1943. In the American military supply chain, these cigarettes represented abundance beyond imagination. The United States produced 343 billion cigarettes in 1943 alone, enough to provide every serviceman with a steady supply of tobacco products, alongside chocolate bars, coffee, and other luxuries that had vanished from Japanese life years earlier. Nurse Tanaka watched with a mixture of fear and curiosity as the American sergeant approached her station. Her training had prepared her for interrogation, for demands, for the brutal treatment she had been taught to expect from occupying forces. Instead, Sergeant O'Brien extended the green pack toward her with a gentle nod. Speaking in broken Japanese he had learned from phrasebooks. Dozo Kango-fu-san. Please, nurse. The gesture violated every assumption she had internalized about American soldiers. This was not the behavior of conquering demons. This was an act of recognition, of respect, of simple human kindness between medical professionals who understood suffering. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cigarettes, not from fear, but from the profound cognitive dissonance of receiving generosity from someone she had been taught to view as an enemy. "Arigato gozaimasu," she whispered, bowing deeply. "Thank you very much." Word of the encounter spread through the hospital like ripples in still water. Other nurses gathered around Nurse Tanaka, examining the Lucky Strike package as if it were an artifact from another world. The green packaging, designed specifically for military distribution, bore the slogan, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war," a reference to the company's decision to change their iconic green package to white, claiming the green dye was needed for military equipment. But to these Japanese nurses, the symbolism ran deeper than marketing slogans. Each cigarette represented something they had not seen in years. Abundance without rationing, generosity without expectation of reciprocation, humanity extending across the chasm of recent enmity. In a nation where tobacco had become so scarce that cigarette butts were collected and re-rolled with newspaper, a full pack of premium American cigarettes was wealth beyond measure. However, the Lucky Strike incident was not isolated. Occupation records from the 8th Army and various medical units document numerous similar encounters across Japan in the autumn of 1945. American soldiers, many of whom had fought brutal Pacific campaigns against Japanese forces, found themselves face to face with civilians, including medical personnel, who bore no resemblance to the fanatical enemies they had faced in jungle warfare. Captain James Harrison, a medical officer with the 6th Army, wrote in his diary, "Today visited civilian hospital in Yokohama. Expected resentment, perhaps sabotage. Instead found nurses working 20-hour shifts with no supplies, treating our wounded alongside their own people. Gave them our cigarette rations. Never saw such gratitude for something we take for granted." The transformation in perception worked both ways. Nurse Tanaka later wrote in a letter to her sister in rural Kyushu, "The American soldiers are not what we were told. They share their food, their tobacco, their medicine. They treat our patients with the same care they give their own. I begin to understand that we were fed lies about these people." This awakening represented more than personal revelation. It marked the beginning of ideological transformation that would reshape Japan's relationship with the Western world. The nurses who accepted those Lucky Strike cigarettes became inadvertent ambassadors for a new understanding. They returned to their families, their communities, their social circles, with first-hand testimony that contradicted years of wartime propaganda. The cigarettes themselves carried profound symbolism within the context of American abundance. While Japan struggled with basic necessities, American forces distributed not just food and medicine, but luxury items as casual gifts. The 243 billion cigarettes manufactured in the United States during 1943 represented industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could imagine. To Japanese nurses accustomed to making bandages from torn sheets and stretching single aspirin tablets across multiple patients, the casual generosity of fully stocked cigarette packs revealed a level of material prosperity that challenged their understanding of the world. But the Lucky Strike packages represented more than abundance. They symbolized a democratic ethos that empowered individual soldiers to make humanitarian gestures without formal authorization. Sergeant O'Brien had not received orders to distribute cigarettes to Japanese medical personnel. His action emerged from personal initiative, from a democratic tradition that valued individual conscience and moral choice. This stood in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy that had governed Japanese military and civilian life, where unauthorized initiative often meant punishment or death. The simple act of giving cigarettes demonstrated a philosophical difference that resonated deeply with Japanese observers. American soldiers operated with a degree of personal freedom that allowed for spontaneous humanity even in the aftermath of total war. The ripple effects of these encounters extended far beyond individual hospital wards. Nurse Tanaka and her colleagues became influential voices in post-war Japanese society, speaking at community meetings, writing letters to newspapers, participating in the gradual process of democratic reform that would transform their nation. Their testimony about American behavior during the occupation helped counter die-hard militarists who continued preaching resistance against democratic reforms. Dr. Kenji Nakamura, chief physician at Tokyo General Hospital, noted in his post-war memoir, "My nurses taught me more about democracy than any political speech. They showed me that former enemies could become friends, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, that individual kindness could bridge national hatred." The Lucky Strike cigarettes became symbols of a new possibility for Japan. The transformation was not without complexity. Some nurses struggled with guilt over their changing perceptions, feeling they betrayed fallen comrades by accepting enemy generosity. Others worried about community reaction to their positive descriptions of American soldiers. But gradually, the evidence became overwhelming. The occupation forces, despite their power to impose harsh treatment, chose instead a path of reconstruction and reconciliation. By Christmas 1945, Nurse Tanaka had learned enough English to communicate directly with American medical personnel. She wrote in her journal, "Today helped treat American soldier wounded in training accident. He thanked me in Japanese he is learning. We are no longer enemies tending enemies. We are medical professionals working together." The Lucky Strike cigarettes from September seem like seeds that grew into something larger than any of us imagined. The cigarettes themselves took on almost totemic significance among the hospital staff. Rather than smoking them immediately, many nurses carefully preserved individual cigarettes as tangible reminders of the moment their worldview shifted. Some kept empty Lucky Strike packages for years, showing them to children and grandchildren as evidence that even the deepest enmity could transform into understanding. Statistical records from the occupation reveal the broader pattern that individual encounters like Nurse Tanaka's represented. By December 1945, American forces had distributed over £2.3 million of medical supplies to Japanese civilian hospitals. Food aid exceeded 15 million tons in the first year of occupation. These numbers, documented in military logistics reports, provide quantitative evidence for the qualitative transformation that Lucky Strike cigarettes symbolized. The psychological impact extended beyond material assistance. Japanese medical personnel, who had been trained to expect execution or brutal treatment if captured, instead found themselves treated as professional colleagues. American doctors consulted with Japanese physicians on treatment protocols. Nurses shared techniques for managing supplies under scarcity conditions. The Lucky Strike cigarettes became symbols of this unexpected professional respect. The broader democratic transformation of Japan found its roots in millions of such individual encounters. Each act of unprompted kindness, each gesture of respect between former enemies, each shared cigarette or chocolate bar, became evidence that the American promise of democratic reform might be genuine rather than propaganda. Historian John Dower, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning analysis of the occupation, noted that the transformation of Japanese attitudes toward Americans happened not through official policies, but through countless personal interactions that challenged wartime stereotypes. Cigarettes, chocolate, and casual conversation proved more effective than any proclamation in demonstrating democratic values. The Lucky Strike cigarettes that Sergeant O'Brien shared with Nurse Tanaka on September 15, 1945, represented more than tobacco. They embodied the radical proposition that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, that individual conscience could guide moral action, that former enemies could recognize each other's humanity, even in the aftermath of total war. As winter gave way to spring in 1946, the transformation became institutionalized. Japanese nurses began working alongside American medical personnel in integrated teams. English classes proliferated throughout Japanese hospitals as medical staff sought to communicate more effectively with their former enemies turned colleagues. Nurse Tanaka, promoted to head nurse by 1947, often told new staff about that September morning when an American sergeant offered her cigarettes instead of condemnation. "That moment taught me that democracy begins with individual choices to show kindness," she would explain. The Lucky Strike cigarettes were not just tobacco. They were invitations to imagine a different kind of world. The symbolic power of those green packages extended into Japan's post-war economic miracle. As Japanese industry rebuilt itself, Lucky Strike cigarettes became markers of prosperity and international connection. They represented not conquest but partnership, not subjugation but mutual respect between former enemies who had learned to see each other as fellow human beings. In the autumn of 1995, 50 years after that first encounter, an elderly Nurse Tanaka spoke at a peace ceremony in Tokyo. In her hand, she held a faded Lucky Strike package, one of the original cigarettes from September 1945. never smoked, preserved as a reminder of the day her understanding of the world fundamentally changed. "This small package taught me that abundance shared creates friendship," she told the assembled crowd. "That individual kindness can overcome national hatred. That democracy is not a political system imposed from above, but a daily choice to recognize the humanity in those we once called enemies. The Lucky Strike cigarettes were gifts from heaven, not because they fell from American planes, but because they opened our hearts to possibilities we had never imagined." The green packages that had once symbolized enemy abundance had become testament to the transformative power of individual conscience, operating within democratic traditions. They represented the radical proposition that former enemies could become partners, that military defeat could become the foundation for unprecedented prosperity, that the sharing of simple luxuries like cigarettes could plant seeds of understanding that would grow into lasting peace. The Lucky Strike cigarettes given by American soldiers to Japanese nurses in the autumn of 1945 remind us that history's greatest transformations often begin not with grand proclamations or political treaties, but with individual acts of recognition, moments when human beings choose to see past the categories of enemy and friend, to acknowledge the fundamental dignity that connects all people, regardless of the uniforms they wear. In those white packages with their red circles, Japanese nurses discovered not conquest but invitation, an invitation to imagine a world where abundance could be shared, where former enemies could become colleagues, where individual kindness could transcend national hatred, and plant the seeds of lasting peace between peoples who had learned, through the simple gift of tobacco, to recognize each other's essential humanity.